right, let's shift to the remaining East Asia countries we'll talk about. And we'll start with Japan. And if we look at the latter part of the 20th century, Japanese economic growth was just a phenomenal story, going from being devastated after the war to being one of the world's top economies. Now, since then, what we've seen is their growth has kind of flattened out. They kind of maxed some of their capabilities as far as resources, population, markets, and they're having to compete with China for some of the goods they used to produce. I'll talk more about that in a second. So the growth is pretty flat now, but they're still a pretty significant economy at being number 4. They're roughly the size of India and slightly behind Germany, so sometimes you'll see them kind of listed at number 5, sometimes at number 4. Even recently they were listed as number 3, but they're in that same kind of group economically. Now, I mentioned this briefly, but this is an island nation, so they have limited resources. And so we're not seeing the same thing we saw in China, Russia, United States, Canada, where those huge areas that they have allow them access and the likelihood of finding necessary resources. So they really have to maximize what they do have. And this high-tech growth we saw in the latter part of the 20th century really helped them in it. And also in some of the things they do export, they tend to use less resources than comparable products from other areas. So how did they do it? Well, really it goes post-World War II, and they had this strong American connection. The Americans were recognizing that the Soviet Union was trying to expand into the other areas, and so they wanted to help Japan grow economically so that they wouldn't turn towards Soviet communism. Now, a little bit later than the Soviet fear was also the growth of Chinese communism. So again, it was the Americans were trying to help them. And so we had favored trade status with some of their products. We allowed them to license some of our technologies. So even though the Americans developed the transistor in radios and electronics, really that market was developed by the Japanese very, very quickly. Now, early on, they had cheap labor. The labor costs in Japan were significantly lower than they were in the United States, and so this was one of the ways that the Japanese electronics really got their start, is because they could be made for so much cheaper, sold in the States at a lower cost than Americans could produce it, and that cheap labor helped fuel a lot of economic growth. That doesn't hold true anymore as far as their labor costs, because they're significantly up since they were in the 1950s and 1960s. And there were Japanese automotive exports to other parts of the world. They had a reputation for being more reliable than some of the American cars, but they really weren't what Americans were looking for in cars for the most part. So sales were not as big in the 60s and 70s as they are now, simply because they were too small for American tastes. We liked our cars, and we used to advertise our cars by how long they were as one of the features. The economic growth is kind of tied to just kind of the business in general. What we see is a management style that kind of promotes and fosters the employees to make recommendations for problems. And so if there's a product quality problem, let's random thing like the Toyota Corolla door handle comes loose too easily during assembly and it takes a lot of time to fix it. If this was an American car, the American process would have been, all right, well, we'll write it down, and so when we retool for next year's model, we'll make sure that that doesn't happen. So they end up with a pick list of things that need to be fixed before the next model year. In Japan, they shut the production line down, they fix that problem, and then they open it up again. So you see this incremental improvements in quality that happen, and so you end up, in the long run, having a more quality product. Also, you see a lot of emphasis in education, more so than in the United States, as far as math, sciences, labor skills, and so they're geared. Their economy and their education system is geared for producing productive workers. Business planning is very different than the United States. We tend to look for quarterly profits and where we're going to be this time next year. And Japanese systems look to where they're going to be in 20 years, where they're going to be in 30 years. The luxury car market, which I'll get to in a second, is an evidence of that. They're also big on savings, and so there's a lot more money available for investment. But the business planning, going back to that, what we see is Japanese recognized that they needed to create a product that had a higher value and in order to make more money. And this was something that you can't go from an automobile that looks like this to these kinds of things overnight. And so they were slowly introducing upscale products within their line. And then in the 1990s, we see this shift to Toyota creating the Lexus line, and all of the Japanese manufacturers creating their luxury versions of their cars. So Honda had Acura. So this was when I was married to Satan. Oh, sorry, my ex-wife. She had bought a Acura Integra, and it's shared like components with the Honda Civic. But it had a different body and a different interior, and it was slightly more expensive than the top of the line Civic. So whatever the luxury Civic was, add a few $100 or $1,000 onto that, and then you got the bottom of the line Acura Integra. Now, it was a bargain for what you were getting. Well, that model of introducing it and getting people like, ooh, this is a better car, and over time, Lexus and Acura became kind of like these more acceptable competitors to some of the other luxury lines, and especially because they were more reliable, we see that Americans were kind of getting away from some of the problematic quality in their own automobiles. One of the things I don't get, though, that with current lines, Lexus just loves these giant grills. I don't get it. It's just weird to me, but whatever. Japanese are the #1 consumers in Asia on a per capita basis. If we look at the total sales, obviously China with over 1.3 billion, they're going to have pretty high sales. But the Japanese are huge consumers, whether it's got ahead of myself. Whether it's electronics, primarily, but this is one of the things that drives their economy, similar to the United States, where we like to buy things in the United States, and it helps our economy. Just a weird side note. So at the end of World War II, the Germans were defeated, but Japan hadn't been defeated yet, but Russia had never declared war on the Japanese during World War II. It wasn't until after Germany was defeated that the Russians actually declared war on Japan, when it was really clear that the Japanese were going to lose. And so what they did was they declared war on them. I don't even know how much effort they put into it, but what happened was that they claimed some islands north of the Japanese islands and main islands, and then south of the Kamchatka Peninsula. And by doing that, that gave them control of ships going in and out of the Oshkosh Sea, and that's a huge strategic importance for them. The Japanese still argue over, and the Russians still argue over whether that was fair or not. It's really hampered some of Russia's economic growth post-Soviet Union in the Pacific, simply because their main trading partner likely could have been the Japanese, but there's still this kind of sticking point between the Kuril Islands, and every now and then it'll come up in some complaint that the Japanese will tend to throw into some United Nations motion, but it's still just this strange thing of like, yeah, we beat the Japanese too, we'll take your islands. We talked about the tsunami in Southeast Asia. We also had a major tsunami in 2011. It was the same thing. We had an earthquake, undersea displacement, flooded some coastal areas. But for here, it really wasn't the loss of life. Yes, it was tragic. But here we saw a nuclear power plant that was damaged and put out of commission. And so now there's a no-go zone around that one because of the nuclear waste that was released during that event. And this is actually one of the driving points of why, when they were closing the San Onofre one, the San Onofre power plant, the nuclear power plant, was like, look what can happen during a tsunami. And so this was just another fuel for the fire of closing that down. And of course, McDonald's, I'm still not sold on the fillet of shrimp, but have at it. All right, let's shift over to the Korean Peninsula. Two countries occupy this. You've got North Korea and South Korea, not real creative on names. Economically, population-wise, South Korea is really dominant. The difference in GNP and population is just staggering. And also, as far as what their main economic engine is, and it's pretty strong in North Korea and South Korea. It's both more efficient, and they rely on imports for a lot of their foods. What happened post World War II, just like what happened in Vietnam, like what happened in Eastern Europe, is that we saw some divisions created with the idea that different groups would help them rebuild. And so we had first some Russian influence in North Korea, and then later like Chinese influence in North Korea, and then South Korea from the Americans in the West. And so we end up with a mostly post-war democratic South Korea, but an authoritarian North Korea. So the communist North, non-communist South. Well, trying to establish dominance in the area, the North Korean communists, with support of the weapons from the Russians and then Chinese support as the war got going on, we went into the Korean War, which basically, over the years that the Korean War was fought, went back and forth with the capital of South Korea almost being captured by the North Koreans, and then they got pushed back. So we end up with a ceasefire line that's roughly where the line was when it was split post-World War II, so not much was accomplished there. So we still have two Koreas. So that line, the boundary between the two, is the demilitarized zone. It's a 2.5 mile buffer between the two countries. There's one area where the two countries can meet and have talks, and so there's this the Joint Security Area in the DMZ that has these buildings that straddle the lines. And so that little cement step in the middle, right in through here, that's the boundary between the two countries. And these North Korean officers, so that's North Korea over there, have come across, and they're just kind of like almost teasing the South Koreans, like, we're going to walk into your country. No, we're not. So they would turn right here and right along the line, and then they would walk out that other way. So here you can see, now we're looking into South Korea, those buildings in United Nations blue with the guards standing there. Apparently one time some North Korean defected through here. He ran through the open area in here and was running into South Korea, and he was being chased by North Korean guards, which of course South Korean guards are chasing the North Korean guards. I don't know the resolution of that, but just the sight of seeing, hey, get out of my country, and then somebody being chased by two different countries' guards in the process. Here's a better view of the typical boundary between the two. And what's strange is that since this has been demilitarized and nobody goes in here, it's become one massive, long wildlife refuge with lots of native plants and animals thriving in there because they're not being bothered. The North Koreans have villages that they'll set up and they'll bus the people out to and make it look like, oh, everything's happy and wonderful in North Korea, and then at the end of the day they bus them back to their real homes. So here what we're seeing is North Korean tunnels were discovered by the South Koreans, and so they created a tourist spot for people from South Korea to go visit the tunnels dug by the North Koreans. It's an odd tourist destination for me. Doesn't sound like Disneyland. The soccer balls you see on the left, sorry, I laugh because it's just funny at a military tunnel you've got soccer balls. This is because when this photo was being taken, Korea was one of the hosts for the World Cup, and so that kind of soccer theme was showing up in different places. And once you're down in the tunnel, this is kind of the wonderful sights you get to see. North Korea, I've mentioned this before, communist and authoritarian, really limited freedoms throughout the country, and a lot of their money is spent on weapons. Unfortunately, it's creating this inefficient, they're often have agricultural shortages. They're really dependent on Russia and China for aid and trade. However, their military, because it is, they put so much emphasis into it, they're one of the places that Iran is getting weapons from. And this kind of trade of weaponry and technology is one of the risks that the West is often talking about. And when they talk about ties between North Korea and Iran, is this military partnership they have as far as missile and rocket development. Kim Jong-un is their current president. I forgot his exact title. I apologize. And what's making me laugh about this recent escalation of tensions is that I've been lecturing on North Korea for a few decades now. And even as we get into our current presidential administration, they're always said that, they're a threat, they're going to be a problem, they're going to attack South Korea, They're weeks away from doing something horrible to somebody, and it's an ongoing issue that's been happening since the end of the Korean War, where there's this tension. And in fact, there's, as I record this, there's a current conflict in Iran, and the North Koreans took the opportunity to do some small-scale firing of artillery into South Korea. Nothing major, but it was just kind of a way of testing what was going on, because of the West's attention was diverted elsewhere. And they have long-range missiles that are capable of reaching the United States at this point, but I don't know why they would attack Alaska, but who knows. Now, South Korea had an authoritarian government into the 1980s. General Park was their leader, and the picture you're seeing here, there was an assassination attempt on him. They missed and shot the wife and killed her, and he went on to finish the speech. Awesome. So they were a couple decades behind the economic development of Japan, so we'd seen Japanese labor costs go up, and so now one of the areas that was attractive to low-cost labor was South Korea. And so we start to see inexpensive electronics, inexpensive automobiles, because of the cheaper labor happening in South Korea. That's changed a lot there as well, where the initial stuff coming out of South Korea was of really poor quality. My sister-in-law had one of the first years of the Hyundai, and she was opening the car door, and just as she just pulled on the door handle, the whole assembly for the door handle just came off the car. Not so today. Their corporations, what we see is something that's actually illegal in the United States. It's a vertical integration of the businesses. And so the businesses will own the source area for the raw materials. They'll own the transportation of getting that raw materials to a refinery or wherever, and then they'll own the factory that makes the finished goods. They own the trucks that take those to the port. They own the ships that ship it to markets. And so by controlling top to bottom, they really have control over the prices. And so this is vertical integration. I'll give an example in just a second. And this is, it takes a while to develop, but it's something that the government kind of helped promote to get the businesses going a few decades ago, and it's made a lot of people really wealthy who were involved in those corporations. Now, what we've seen here is the improving quality, and the marks that these cars are getting, whether it's Hyundai and Genesis, they did the same thing there. It was like they needed an upscale brand, so they just made some fancier Hyundais and called them Genesis. But we're seeing an improving quality in these areas too. And so these are often your viable, lower cost car to buy that has better reliability than some, if this is an issue for you. But I personally wouldn't compare a Genesis with a Lexus as far as quality, but that's okay. And apparently the South Koreans have an obsession with large grills as well. Daewoo vertically integrated. Here, go to Hyundai real quick, because here you've got the ships are built and owned by Hyundai. The steel is generated by a Hyundai steel mill. Even these lifts that are used to get the cargo onto the ships are owned by Hyundai. The containers are made by Hyundai. They're shipped by the Hyundai shipping company. All of these things create this kind of massive control over everything. My ex-wife, look, she made it into lecture twice this time, was on Jeopardy and came in second place, and she won a Hyundai computer, which is not really that popular anymore. In fact, I don't even know if they're available in the States. I don't have a good McDonald's picture for South Korea. Although putting your McDonald's next to an athlete's foot store is kind of questionable. All right, Taiwan. This, just like South Korea and North Korea, where there's ongoing tensions between them, we can say the same thing about Taiwan and Chinese, and I'll get to that in a second. So, obviously, when we talked about China, the rise of communism, well, the people who were in charge were the Chinese nationalists. They were the ones that were overthrown by the communists. So most of them fled to Taiwan. And with them came everybody that recognized what happened in the Soviet Union as far as the intellectual and those with money. They all fled the Chinese mainland and they fled to Taiwan. So you kind of populated China real quickly in 1949 and 1950 with a lot of wealthy, smart people. And so that is what jump-started their economy as well. So Taiwan is a major electronic producer as well, with, again, a lot of American support. So the Taiwanese make high-value electronics. They really were early participants in the computer kind of revolution that happened in the personal computer revolution that started in the 1990s. And that brought money in as well. But again, like I can have this in my slide set for years and years and years and years having issues with China. Chinese think they're a renegade province and they'll be brought back under Chinese control and no other option is even considered. And then the Taiwanese consider themselves to be an independent nation, but maybe they might get a relationship. So it's a little bit fuzzier in Taiwan, but for the most part, they do not want to be part of China. To give an example of how tensions can get really strained is in 1995, we had the Chinese were going to test missiles, and they're going to launch them from Quemoy, but their test site wasn't the South China Sea. Their test point was over here in the Pacific Ocean. So obviously, if you're going to fire missiles to test them, it's going to go right over Taiwan, which is a huge aggressive act. So the then President Bill Clinton parked the Pacific Fleet in the Taiwan Strait, and so therefore, if they were going to fire, they'd be firing missiles at the Pacific Fleet, and that could be considered a hostile act. The Chinese backed down and retargeted to the South China Sea, but it was a huge humiliation for the Chinese, and it really kind of created their want to take more control of the South China Sea and have more control in the region as well, and not be bullied by the Americans. Just ongoing things about cooperation, but of course you can get the ever awesome McRice burger in Taiwan. All right, thanks for listening. Our next stop is Australia.